Vermont is yielded 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Owens. I am delighted to work with Mr. Owens of New York on this amendment, which is fully supported by the Progressive Caucus. This is the first of 11 amendments which the Progressive Caucus intends to offer in opposition to the Republican contract with America. Mr. Chairman, the Republican proposal for a balanced budget amendment is wrong for a number of reasons. It is wrong because within the context of its offering, there will be major tax breaks for the wealthiest people in America. There will also be significant increases in defense spending. Every economist, therefore, understands that if we move toward a balanced budget within that context in a period of 5 years, there will be devastating cuts in Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, veterans programs, college loan and grant programs, and nutrition programs for hungry children. When my friend from Illinois talks about spending cuts, in essence, that's what he is talking about. Savage cuts which will impact horrendously on some of the weakest and most vulnerable people in this country. But there is another reason why the Republican balanced budget amendment is wrong, and that is it does not deal with the economic crisis which this country is currently experiencing. Despite articles in the newspapers which tell us how the economy is booming, many of us in the Progressive Caucus do not believe that. We see that the rich are getting richer, but we also see that poverty is growing, that the middle class is shrinking, and that the new jobs being created in this country are very often low-wage, part-time, temporary jobs without decent benefits. What the Republican balanced budget amendment would do is make it virtually impossible for this country to go forward with a major jobs program to put millions of people to work rebuilding this country at decent wages. Mr. Chairman, all over the world, in Japan, in Europe, and in Canada, governments are rebuilding their physical and human infrastructure, their mass transportation systems, their sewer systems, their roads, their bridges, their child care needs. And in the process, they are putting large numbers of people to work, making those countries more competitive, more efficient, and paying their workers good wages in doing that work. What our amendment does is say, let us not tie the hands.
The gentleman has expired.
I would ask for 1 minute more.
One additional minute, the gentleman.
Gentleman
What this
is recognized for one
amendment
additional minute.
says is let us not tie the hands of the federal government in rebuilding our infrastructure and putting Americans back to work at decent wages, making this a better country for all people. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back to the gentleman from New York the balance of his time. The gentleman from Illinois.
I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Illinois reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from New York.
Gentleman, I yield 1 minute to the ranking Democrat on the Economic and Educational Opportunities Committee. Gentleman who was here when the Humphrey Hawkins bill was passed, Mr. Clay of Missouri.
Gentleman from Missouri is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I certainly want to commend the gentleman from New York for offering this substitute. And I rise in strong support of it and commend him for bringing to the floor a balanced budget amendment, a substitute that acknowledges the need to protect unemployed Americans from the harsh consequences of the balanced budget amendment. I support this amendment for two basic reasons. First, the orange substitute strips from the bill the 3/5 supermajority provision for raising revenue. That provision is unconstitutional and has no place in the bill. Second, and just as important, the orange substitute seeks to preserve the full employment policies maintained by the Congress for more than 50 years. Other versions of this amendment constitute a de facto repeal of laws, such as the Hawkins-Humphrey Act, that seek to guarantee jobs for all Americans who desire to work. As the Hawkins-Humphrey law states, and I quote, without full employment, we deprive workers of job security and productivity to maintain and
Has
advance their
expired.
standards of living. Mr. Chairman, I urge support of the amendment.
Gentleman from New York.
Would the gentleman like to donate some
The
time?
gentleman from Illinois has reserved the balance of his time.
I yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Georgia, Ms. McKinney.
Gentleman from Georgia has yielded 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Many of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have advanced the argument that because families and states must balance their budgets, so too should the federal government. Well, we can cite many examples of acceptable and necessary deficit spending done by both families and states. Anyone who has bought a home the old-fashioned way knows this all too well. And anyone who has supported a bond referendum for their state or local government knows that this is necessary. Advancing the personal pocketbook metaphor, while simple and innocently appealing, just isn't accurate. We shouldn't hamstring ourselves because of a marketing slogan for bad policy cooked up in some think tank. The Owens substitute allows an exemption from the balanced budget requirement in the case of national disaster and war. The Owens Amendment adds an exemption for a less than full employment economy. If it's in the national interest to win a war and to rebuild from national disasters, is it not also in our national interest that every able-bodied American have a private sector job? I urge my colleagues to support the Owens Amendment.
Time of the gentlewoman has expired. Gentleman from New York.
Mr. Chairman, I yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Velasquez. 2 minutes to...
Gentlewoman from New York is recognized for...
2 minutes.
2 minutes.
For 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I rise in strong support of the Owens substitute. Like several other measures introduced today, the Owens Amendment rejects the 3/5 majority straitjacket that the majority has on for the balanced budget amendment. However, only this substitute will maintain our national commitment to economic opportunity and full employment. Under its provisions, Congress retains authority to enact emergency measures necessary to help every man and woman in this country take their place in the workforce. This body has affirmed its obligation to maximize employment opportunities on several occasions since the Great Depression. With the Full Employment Act and the Humphrey-Hawkins Bill, we established full employment as a national priority. Today, Congress threatens to repeal that oath. With passage of an unamended balanced budget amendment, we severely restrict our ability to respond to economic downturns and resulting job losses. We forgot our ability to invest in the labor force through skill development, job creation, and income support. We tell the unemployed and the underemployed, sorry, we cannot help. Our hands are tied. This is precisely the wrong time in our nation's history to hamstring Congress. The current recovery compares poorly with those that followed the previous 2 recessions. Fewer jobs are being generated. Much of the current economic growth is taking place in lower-wage industries. Moreover, workers least able to weather economic downturns have fared poorly. Between 1991 to 1994, the unemployment rate fell only 0.2% for Afro-Americans. The number of Latinos without jobs increased by 13%. The response from the other side of the aisle might be that nothing in the balanced budget amendment or their so-called contract with America precludes Congress from helping to increase job prospects for the unemployed or the underemployed.
The gentlelady has expired.
I urge my colleagues to join me in voting for the Owens substitute.
The gentleman from New York.
Mr. Chairman, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Fatah.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of the Owens substitute by way of an example. In 1983, as a freshman member of the State Assembly in Pennsylvania, under the leadership of Governor Dick Thornburgh, during a recession at that time, the state legislature and the governor moved forward on a borrowing program called PennPride that invested over $160 million at that time in job training programs like the Pennsylvania Conservation Corps, employee ownership programs, business incubators and the like. The state took the opportunity in a time of economic downturn to invest in business and job training activities to benefit the citizens of the Commonwealth. This amendment would give the United States government the same opportunity so that when there's a downturn in the economy and unemployment is unreasonably low, that we would have that opportunity, and I would hope that the House would seriously consider the Owens Amendment, and I thank the Speaker.
Gentleman from New York.
Mr. Chairman, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from California, Mr. Brown.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection. Gentleman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
Mr. Chairman, 1 minute is not nearly enough for me to say all I want to say about this amendment or this bill, but I'll do the best I can. I rise today in support of our balanced budget amendment substitute being offered by my good friend Major Owens of New York and Mr. Sanders. As most of my colleagues know, I have consistently opposed balanced budget amendments over the years. In the current form that's proposed, I will vote against it again, but I will defy my own history and vote for this substitute, because this version of the balanced budget amendment puts the American people first and upholds one of the most basic American values, the value of work. This version of the balanced budget amendment is like every other, except it gives us, the members of this body, the flexibility we need to do the work of the nation. This version contains a provision that would allow Congress to waive the requirement in any year that unemployment exceeds 4%.
Has expired. Gentleman is yielded an additional 1 minute.
This makes perfect sense. If we achieve 4% unemployment or less, balancing the federal budget will be easier and possible. We will have fewer people receiving benefits such as unemployment and welfare and more people in the workplace. It's a fairly simple formula. Revenues increase and expenditures decrease. But if we enact a balanced budget amendment that does not give us this flexibility, we will not be able to help those who will need our help in future recessions. Imagine the shape our nation would be in today if we had this constitutional provision during the Great Depression, when the employees, the people of this country, were being crushed by depression. The New Deal programs could not have been passed, and of course many of you would praise that. In the past 60 years, Congress has passed emergency job bills to pull our economy out of recession, the most recent of which was the 1982 Reagan recession. But even in times of great prosperity, there's been a continued commitment to the idea of putting people to work. The gentleman has again expired. I thank the chairman.
The gentleman from New York.
Chairman, I yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from California, Ms. Waters.
Thank you very much.
Gentlelady from California is yielded 2 minutes. Without objection.
Mr. Speaker and members, I rise in support of the Owens substitute. It is very simple. It would waive the amendment if and when unemployment exceeds 4%. I don't think the American people realize the devastation that this constitutional amendment could cause in our society. Aside from doing away with services that are so desperately needed, aside from perhaps dismantling Social Security, Head Start program, Medicare, veteran services, all of the jobs that are associated with those services will be lost. Unemployment could plummet. Let me just tell you, it is time for us to focus on what we've been doing to the American people. We have allowed our industries to export jobs to third world countries for cheap labor. I just heard the other day that Reebok is going to move its operations to India. They're going to get that cheap labor, they're going to give them the jobs, then they're going to send those sporting goods back here for us to pay $125 and $150 for tennis shoes, but we won't be able to have the jobs making those goods. When are we going to stop taking jobs away from Americans? When are we going to draw the line? We have to draw the line with this constitutional amendment. It may pass. The contract with America says they're going to do it. It may happen, but for God's sakes, let's have a safety valve. Let's put in this amendment so that if it reaches above 4%, we will be able to suspend it. I yield back the balance of my time.
Time of the gentlelady has expired. Gentleman from New York.
Chairman, I yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Woolsey.
Gentlewoman from California is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, today the American people are learning some very important things about the contract on America. They're learning that many people in this chamber keep saying they want to balance the budget, but that they will not muster the political will to lay out a plan. They will not protect Social Security from future budget cuts, and they will not give jobs and full employment the priority they deserve. And this is only the beginning of the contract on America, Mr. Chairman. As we debate other items in the contract, it will become clear that Star Wars has priority over student aid, and that maintaining the CIA budget is more important than preventing crime on our streets. That is why the Progressive Caucus is offering an alternative to the contract on America, which replaces the contract's voodoo economics with the restoration of fairness in this country. The Owens-Sanders Amendment is the important first step in a progressive plan, a plan which waives the provisions of the Balanced Budget Amendment when unemployment exceeds 4%. Too often these days, conservative economists fail to consider the employment rate as a serious indicator of economic health. Well, Mr. Chairman, the Progressive Caucus believes that it doesn't matter how fast America is growing if people aren't working. We must invest in jobs. We cannot tell unemployed people throughout this country that we're sorry, but the Constitution of the United States of America does not allow us to invest in job creation that will put you back to work and help you feed your family. Mr. Chairman, we now have the opportunity to correct the contract's mistakes. By voting in favor of the Owens-Sanders Amendment, we will protect working people of this country.
Time of the gentlelady has expired. The gentleman from New York.
Gentleman, I yield myself 1 minute.
The gentleman's recognized for 1 minute.
Gentlemen, I'd like to take 1 minute to make an urgent appeal to the other side that they give us some more time. I have a long list of speakers who would like to talk about this subject. Right now, there are 7 million Americans who are unemployed. If we allow ourselves to spend just enough money to stimulate the economy to employ another 2 million people, thereby lowering the unemployment rate to 4%, then we will save $60 to $100 billion. The Congressional Budget Office has indicated that every 1% reduction in unemployment leads to a net gain in the U.S. Treasury of $40 to $50 billion. This is an item that we'd like to have at least an hour to discuss. If the opposition is not going to use their time, let us speak for those American voters who have a great deal of anxiety about jobs. American voters have spoken loud and clear about their fears about losing their jobs. In the interviews at the exit polls on November 8th, working people explained their anger. Wages are too low, corporate downsizing, streamlining and slave labor. I yield myself an additional minute.
The gentleman's recognized for 1 additional minute.
Wages are too low. Corporate downsizing, streamlining, and the pursuit of slave labor in Mexico and China have intensified the fears of those who are working today about losing their jobs tomorrow. And among the millions who have been unemployed for many months and some for years, all hope of ever getting a decent job is fading fast. The voices of fear and anger are loud and clear, but nobody in power in Washington wants to listen. I regret it very much that nobody wants to listen. This substitute is designed to send a message to the working families of America. We are listening. Members of the Progressive Caucus are listening. We are fighting to have your concerns and your priorities recognized. When the jobs crisis becomes more obvious to our colleagues here in the Congress and other powers in Washington, then the speeches we are making today will be used to help shape the policies of tomorrow.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman has 9.5 minutes remaining. The gentleman from Illinois wish to be recognized.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I yield 3 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Texas, Mr. Stenholm.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized for 3 minutes. Without objection.
Mr. Chairman, I voted against the previous amendment because of my belief of the unintended consequences that could happen with the language of the 3/5 increase in taxes. The arguments that were made were many, but there were tremendous unintended consequences that I believed could happen. Now, I want to commend my colleague, Mr. Owens, for his proposal to this debate. I'm pleased that he has joined the growing number of members who support the principle of amending the Constitution to mandate a balanced budget. However, I must oppose his amendment also because of what I believe are unintended consequences. Under the Owens amendment, the balanced budget requirement could be waived by a simple majority if the President notifies Congress that the national unemployment rate is projected to exceed 4%. Unemployment has exceeded 4% for 36 of the last 40 years. The last time unemployment was less than 4% was, I'll be happy to yield.
Okay. The gentleman makes the point that unemployment, as my friend from Illinois made, is perhaps 5.5% now. Do you really believe, forgetting the official statistics, that with the growth of jobs at 20 hours a week, you are aware, sir, that if you work for 20 hours a week for $4.50 an hour, you are considered employed, even if you had a postgraduate degree?
No, sir, I do not. And
that is, in fact, the case. That part-time workers are considered as employed workers. You are aware of the fact that if you have a job for 3 months, a temporary job, you are considered fully employed. You are aware of the fact that if in your community there are no jobs and you give up active searching for a job, that you are not considered part of the unemployed. The point that I'm trying to make to my friend from Texas is while the official statistics may say 5.5%, what serious economists will tell us is that real unemployment, in terms of people wanting to work 40 hours a week, is probably double that. And that's the point that I wanted to make. And I thank the gentleman for yielding.
I thank the gentleman for making that point. I would just point out that is not relevant to the debate that we are talking about today, in my opinion. I will be joining with the gentleman and the lady sitting behind him who will be chairing a task force on welfare reform in which we begin to look at how we solve that problem in the proper course, in the proper place in the legislative effort. Just as I have argued also with those that suggest that we ought to lay out our plan before we pass a balanced budget constitutional amendment. That's getting the cart before the horse. We all know that this year's budget resolution is when we're going to put the plan out, and unless we do a credible job in the first year with projections for 7 years, we will in fact not have the credibility that this member of Congress wants to see that we do, and I answer the same way on both your question and your point as I do on the point that I'm making.
The gentleman has expired.
Could I have 3 additional minutes?
I yield the gentleman 3 additional minutes.
The gentleman is recognized for 3 additional minutes.
Going back to the point I was trying to make on the amendment before us, in other words, the Owen Amendment would have prevented us from accumulating $4.3 trillion in debt over the last 25 years. Now, so many of the arguments we're hearing today seem to be arguing against balancing the budget. I'm arguing for balancing the budget. The debt that we have piled up is the greatest threat to our economic well-being, including specifically the people the gentleman from Vermont has talked about just a moment ago. The General Accounting Office has warned us that if we continue on our current course, we will doom future generations to a stagnating standard of living, damage U.S. competitiveness, and hamper our ability to address pressing national needs. The interest on this debt crowds out other spending and prevents us from making the investments we should have to make to strengthen our economy. We spend 5.5 times as much on interest on the debt as we do on all federal education, job training, and employment programs. This will only get worse until we stop accumulating debt. Requiring Congress to bring the budget under control will improve our ability to respond to recessions. The existing deficit problem prevents Congress and the President from effectively responding to recessions. We currently run deficits in good times as well as bad. Large annual deficits provide a political and economic impediment to enactment of tax cuts or investment spending to stimulate the economy during economic downturns. We are already stimulating the economy to the tune of $150 to $200 billion in deficit spending each year today. In this climate, the short-term economic impact of any stimulus package enacted by Congress would be minimal at best. And the long-term impact simply is an addition to the economic drag of the deficit. The political climate will be unfavorable for tax cuts or spending increases that are not offset until the budget is balanced. I agree that Congress must have the flexibility to respond to recessions. The Schaefer-Stenholm Amendment provides this flexibility. In the event of a serious economic downturn or other national emergency, Congress would be able to muster a 3/5 majority to enact a countercyclical package of tax cuts or investment spending as rapidly as it does currently. If Congress cannot obtain 3/5 support to respond to unbalance the budget, the situation probably is not a true emergency. What the Schaefer-Stenholm Amendment will do is stop us from spending and borrowing in good times as well as bad. The automatic stabilizers such as unemployment insurance would continue to operate under the balanced budget amendment. If CBO projects that increased spending and lower tax revenues resulting from the automatic stabilizers may cause outlays to exceed receipts, we will be able to determine the reason for the deficit and act accordingly. The Schaefer-Stenholm Amendment will force Congress to acknowledge the impending deficit and decide whether the economic circumstances justify deficit spending. For the sake of our economic future, I urge you to vote against the Owens Amendment and for the Schaefer-Stenholm.
Would the gentleman yield so I might ask a question of the
I'll yield the gentleman 2 additional minutes.
The gentleman has yielded 2 additional minutes.
If the gentleman, I do not wish to ask the gentleman from Texas a question. I would like to direct a question to the chairman of the committee, if I might.
Well, I still yield the gentleman. If you'll yield to me, then
I'll be happy to yield to the chairman for response to the
I will yield to the
Minnesota.
gentleman from Minnesota.
Well, the gentleman from Texas controls the time. Does the
I
gentleman
yield
from
to the
Texas
gentleman
yield
from
to
Illinois.
the gentleman from Minnesota for the purpose of the
I thank the gentleman for
question?
yielding, and I will engage in a dialogue with the gentleman from Minnesota if he wishes to commence it.
Okay. I am curious how your amendment...
Just yield to the gentleman from Minnesota.
I yield to the gentleman from Minnesota.
I thank the gentleman. And my question to the chairman of the committee, through the gentleman from Texas, is I'm curious how your basic amendment deals with our unemployment compensation program in this country. And
I'll be happy to yield to the gentleman from Minnesota to respond to the question of the gentleman from Minnesota.
Let me explain a little further. That is a federal program.
I yield back to the gentleman from Minnesota.
I thank the gentleman.
I yield back to...
That it is a federal program. However, the benefits are established by states. The unemployment tax is decided by the states. Those revenues then flow into what is a federal fund. Those revenues are considered part of our revenues. The expenditures are also considered federal expenditures. During times of higher employment, the states accumulate surpluses, but those are also counted in the federal budget. In time of recession, in downturn of the economy, the state balances go down, but that also is reflected in the federal budget. If the states, as I understand it, their fund goes to zero, they then borrow from the federal government, and I recall that happening when I was in the state legislature.
Gentleman
they
from
now
Texas
pay
has
interest.
expired. Does the gentleman from Illinois wish to yield himself time?
Yes, I'll yield myself 30 seconds to say that the amendment doesn't deal with that specific subject. As the gentleman knows, outlays and revenues are still computed under the amendment as they are today.
Well, the outlays then of the state unemployment comp funds would be considered, even though they are really state funds, would be considered federal outlays.
How are they considered now?
They are counted as outlays in the federal budget.
Then they will
even
be
though
outlays.
they are
Our
funds collected at the individual state level.
The time of the gentleman has expired.
If the gentleman would just, frankly, I would...
The time of the gentleman has expired.
I yield myself 30 seconds to say CBO has answered that question, that outlays and receipts will be treated under the amendment. such as you're speaking of, exactly as they are treated now. There will be no change.
That would mean...
The gentleman from Minnesota has no time unless he is yielded to.
I'm running out of answers, tell the gentleman. The same treatment that exists now will exist under the amendment insofar as outlays and receipts. And if it is considered a federal outlay, then it will be a federal outlay and will count against the ceiling of the balanced budget amendment.
Time of the gentleman from Illinois has expired. The gentleman from New York.
Mr. Chairman, I yield to the gentleman from California for unanimous consent request.
Gentleman from California.
Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks in connection with the Barton Amendment, which was previously passed.
Without objection.
Mr. Chairman, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Sabo.
Gentleman from Minnesota has yielded you 1 minute.
I thank the gentleman. I think you have major problems with how this amendment does treat unemployment comp funds, which are funds which are accumulated at times when the economy is working better, spent out at times of recessions. The natural counter-secular impact of the unemployment comp program, which is a unique federal-state program, I think there are serious complications for that program under the language of these amendments. Another question that I frankly have is because the revenues which are levied by states as unemployment premiums or taxes, I don't know if they're considered taxes under your bill, and I do not know what the relationship is of the new requirements of any revenue being passed by whatever percentage it is in Congress, and the relevance to that when the actual decision currently is made by a state legislature. It clearly is a different type and very complicated legal question.
Time of the gentleman has expired.
Mr. Chairman, I'll yield myself 30 seconds and just say under Section 8 of the proposed amendment, legislation is proposed or is the opportunity for legislation to help implement the amendment, and these difficult problems of definitions can be addressed when we legislate pursuant to Section 8. Thank you. Yield back.
The gentleman from New York.
Mr. Chairman, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Henchy.
The gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Request permission to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
Mr. Chairman, I think that we have just had some very important and useful insight into the difficulties of this problem resulting from the conversation that has just been had between the former chairman of the Budget Committee and the now chairman of the Judiciary Committee. We are beginning to see in that window and others which will be provided the serious deficiencies in this proposed constitutional amendment dealing with establishing a supermajority to raise taxes and to deal with the necessities of this country. I'm opposed to amending and tampering with the Constitution in this way. But if we are to do it, we ought to at least do it in a way that recognizes the basic needs of the people of this country. We've just seen, for example, that such basic needs as unemployment insurance are going to be threatened as a result of the passage of this constitutional amendment, should it pass. We ought to at least adopt the kind of safeguards that are proposed in the Owens-Sanders amendment. First of all, it removes the obnoxious provision requiring a 3/5 or supermajority to do the important work of this Congress. Once you establish the need for a supermajority, you put into power a minority, and you establish a situation, contrary to the 206-year history of this country, which will allow a minority of the members of this House of Representatives and the members of the Congress to make important decisions and, in fact, guide and rule the country. That is a very serious mistake. The Owens-Sanders amendment does away with that. Secondly, it does something else that is very important. It recognizes that we have now a constitutional responsibility to not only provide for the common defense, but also to promote the general welfare. And we promote the general welfare in many ways, not the least of which is by attempting to provide honest opportunities for employment for the people of this country. That's why this amendment is so important and ought to be passed.
Gentleman from Illinois.
Mr. Chairman, I yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Schaefer.
Gentleman from Colorado is yielded 1 minute.
The chairman for yielding me, and I just wanted to make one basic point, and as I understand, this constitutional amendment would be waived should it become law any time that the unemployment rates go above 4%. And if one would look at this, the amendment, should it be passed, would have been waived every year since 1969. So I'm not really sure on what we're trying to accomplish here, particularly the time element that I've been in Congress. The national debt has went up $3 trillion in about 11 years. And so I would just say that I would strongly oppose this amendment and support the Schaefer-Stenholm.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from New York has 6.5 minutes remaining.
I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from New Jersey, the chairman of the Congressional Black Caucus, Mr. Payne.
Gentleman from New Jersey has yielded 2 minutes. Without objection.
Minute to the gentleman from New Jersey.
Thank you very much.
New Jersey has an additional minute for a total of 3 minutes.
Thank you, and I appreciate the gentleman yielding. Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to the balanced budget amendment as it currently stands and urge my colleagues to support the Owens amendment, the Owens substitute. The Owens substitute does not include the provision requiring a supermajority to vote to raise taxes, and more importantly, a provision stating the terms of the constitutional amendment may be waived for any fiscal year for which the President notifies the Congress that the national unemployment rate is projected to exceed the 4%. Mr. Speaker, the Owens substitute offers a very feasible alternative to HRES 1 because it recognizes the need to balance the budget without being fiscally irresponsible. It allows Congress to balance the budget so long as jobs and livelihood of hardworking Americans are not jeopardized. Without the fiscal responsibility provided in this substitute, the Congress will be stripped of our power and obligation to help provide jobs to unemployed Americans, at least during bad economic times. Our country would never have pulled out of the Great Depression 50 years ago if Congress had not been able to enact job programs like the WPA program and the CC camps. Since that time, Congress has repeatedly needed to enact emergency jobs bills to pull our nation out of recessions, one that we could recall in the early 80s. Mr. Speaker, I strongly urge my colleagues to understand the importance of fiscal responsibility in regards to the budget. That is one reason I oppose HRES 1. It is fiscally irresponsible as well as deceiving to the American people. I call on the leaders of the majority to explain to the American people how we intend to balance the budget without touching Medicare or without dealing with Social Security, with increasing defense spending, and without raising taxes. That is really going to be a large order to fill. I would also ask the majority leadership to explain how it intends to do when Americans are faced with an economic crisis. As we know, jobs are moving offshore. We have problems now with the new NAFTA agreement, and soon the GATT treaty will go into effect. And so how will that impact on us long term? Mr. Speaker, Congress cannot afford to approve legislation that may be popular, sound good, but maybe have devastating consequences for our people. We must continue to put people first. Let's support fiscal responsibilities. I think we all want to move towards a balanced budget, but it must be done fiscally responsibly. Therefore, I urge you to support the Owens substitute. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Time of the gentleman has expired. Does the gentleman from Illinois wish to yield additional time?
I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from New York.
Chairman, I'll yield 1 minute. The gentleman from California, Mr. Pissarro.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 1 minute. Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the gentleman from New York and the gentleman from Vermont for bringing forward what I believe is a prudent and real-life circumstance substitute amendment to this balanced budget amendment that we have before us. I say real life because we're always told, let's look at what a family does to balance its family budget. That's what I think we need to do. And my family, when I think back to the times that I was in college trying to get through school, I had to borrow money. My parents couldn't pay my way through, and I worked through my way as well, but I could not pay all of my expenses just by working as well. But my father happened to be a day laborer where he worked all his life out in the streets. He built roads. During the rainy seasons, he'd work less and he'd have to find a second job, so his income fluctuated. On those years when it was least rainy, he worked quite a bit. Those rainy seasons where it lasted months, he'd work less and he'd have to find a second job. If my parents had to live under the current budget amendment that's being proposed by the majority party, I wouldn't have been able to make it through school. Under the Owens amendment, I can do so. My family could have done so. That's why I believe we have to take into account real family circumstances, and I would urge my members to vote for this Owens amendment.
Time of the gentleman has expired. Gentleman from New York.
Mr. Chairman, I yield 2 minutes. Gentleman from Vermont, Mr. Sanders.
Gentleman from Vermont is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding and ask unanimous consent to revise.
Without objection.
Mr. Chairman, let me conclude my thoughts by making just several points. The balanced budget amendment approach being brought forth by the Republican majority within the context of asking, as I understand it, for a $60 billion increase in military spending and major tax breaks for the wealthiest people in this country, leads all serious economists to the conclusion that the balanced budget amendment will be a disaster for working people, for elderly people, for low-income people. It will mean, in my view, the destruction of the Social Security system as we know it. It will mean savage cuts in Medicare, in Medicaid, in the opportunity of young people to get grants and loans to go to college. It will mean major cutbacks in nutrition programs for hungry children. It will tamper with the unemployment compensation program, as we heard earlier. It will be a disaster for the vast majority of the people in this country. Mr. Owens and I and members of the Progressive Caucus, furthermore, do not accept the belief of some that our economy is booming and doing well. We think, in fact, that if you look at part-time jobs, if you look at temporary jobs, if you look at people who would like to work but have no jobs in their communities, that unemployment is probably 10% or higher. And we think it would be devastating to the future of this country and the needs of middle-income and working people if we took away the ability of the United States government to go forward with jobs programs. And we believe, especially right now,
time of the gentleman has expired.
Mr. Chairman, I'll yield an additional minute to Mr. Sanders, an additional minute to Mr. Owen, and then yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields an additional minute to Mr. Sanders, a minute to Mr. Owens, and yields back the balance of his time. So all time has expired on the majority side.
The essence, and I thank the gentleman for yielding.
The gentleman from Vermont is recognized for 1 additional minute.
The essence of what we are saying is that the economy is not booming. The standard of living of middle America and working people is in decline. Unemployment is far higher than the official statistics indicate. It seems to us to be very foolhardy to take away an option of the federal government that we may wish to use, which says that when our physical and human infrastructure is in collapse, when our mass transportation system is in so much need, when our roads are falling apart, when our bridges are collapsing, that it does not make sense to take away the option that the United States Congress may wish to use, and which the Progressive Caucus believes is necessary, to rebuild the physical and human infrastructure of America, and in the process put 1 million people to work. I thank the gentleman very much.
The gentleman from New York has 2.5 minutes remaining.
Mr. Chairman, to close out, I'd like to urge a vote for this substitute because it addresses a very deeply rooted and urgent problem in our economy. There were 5 recessions between 1949 and 1973. During the years following each of these recessions, unemployment rates averaged between 3 and 5.5% respectively. But during the years of recovery following the 4 recessions that have occurred since 1973, unemployment rates have averaged 6.7, 7.6, 6.7, and 7%, higher, far higher than before. We have a deep structural problem. People who are unemployed have been just left out there to suffer. No government policies have been designed to lift them out of unemployment. They've just been ignored, and they are still being ignored. The American workers, those who are working, are being ignored because they have wages at much lower levels than they ever had before. Those who are working and who are fearful of losing their jobs because the companies are picking up to go to Mexico or to China are concerned, and they've expressed their anger. And then there's a vast majority of people who are unemployed who are not even counted because they've stopped looking for work. So we have a problem. To promote the general welfare is as much a responsibility of our government as any other responsibility. We are ignoring the people who need help the most. We are ignoring the fact that the management of the economy is one obligation of all those who are in power. Those who govern must govern in a way to guarantee that there's at least an opportunity to earn a living with dignity, to earn an income which allows a person to survive with dignity. We are ignoring that at our own peril. The advice that we're giving today, the jobs bill that will be sponsored by the Progressive Caucus and offered on Monday, will offer an alternative to ignoring this phenomenon. It will offer an alternative to the indifference. We have heard the voice of the American wage earners. We are listening, and we intend to do a great deal about it. And we'd like to have, in the future, the option to do whatever is necessary, when it is necessary, by promoting those fiscal policies and economic policies which will increase the opportunities for employment. Job creation programs are as important as any other activity of the government. No balanced budget amendment should close off the option and deprive us
Time of the gentleman from New York has expired.
Providing jobs to the American people. I urge a yes vote on this substitute.
All time has expired. The question occurs on the amendment of the gentleman from New York. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed will say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Mr. Chairman, I ask for a recorded vote. Pending that, I make a point of order that the quorum is not present.
Gentleman requests a recorded vote and makes a point of order that the quorum is not present. Obviously, a quorum is not present.